the moments in Gwangju, and the people ask about the humanity inside their mind, inside their heart. And there was
것을 다시 듣고 쓰고 있는 것이겠죠. 그리고 광주는 거기에 마지막까지 남아있었던 모든 사람들이 많은 무명이었던 사람들이 있었던 것처럼 이름이 없는 사람들이요. 단순히 민주운동이 무엇인가, 민주의 정신이 무엇인가만이 아니라 민주화 운동 안에서 타자와 어둠이 무엇이었는가, 그리고 빛과 어둠이 무엇이었는가, 서울과 주변이 무엇인가, 중심과 주변이 무엇인가라는 것을 끊임없이 다시 생각하게 하는 그런 지점이라고 저는 생각하고 있습니다. 제가 오늘 드리려고 하는 것은 바로 이러한 한밤 속의 접촉, 그리고 그것을 어떻게 듣고 쓸 수 있는가는 두 가지입니다. 그 무명의 존재들은 사실은 죽음으로서만 말할 수 있었지요. 죽는 순간에 침묵으로만 말할 수 있었습니다. 그것을 어떻게 우리가 다시 그것을 듣고 쓸 수 있을까라는 것이 오늘의 주제입니다. 발리바르가 쓴 프랑스의 테러가 있었던 직후에 쓴 글에서 전쟁 중이라는 글 안에서 이런 말을 합니다. 우리는 전쟁 중이다. 그리고 여태까지 있었던 그 수많은 착종된 그리고 축적된 여러 가지 상황들이 한꺼번에 몰려든 그 상황 안에서 전쟁 중이다. 그 안에는 오래된 신학적 증오들이 다시 그 고개를 든다. 이 상황은 지금 한국에 있는 수많은 혐오나 그 헤이트 스피치나 이런 것들을 생각해 봤을 때 맞는 말인 것 같습니다. 그런데 서구가 냉전이라고 이야기했을 때 아시아는 늘 열전이었습니다. 아시아는 늘 전쟁 중이었지요. 그렇지만 발리바르가 있었던 이 말은 또 하나의 상황을 알려주는 것 같습니다. 그것은 무엇이냐면 이제 전쟁이 민족과 민족 사이에서 국가와 국가 사이에서만이 아니라 하나의 민족 안에서, 하나의 공동체 안에서, 하나의 코뮌 안에서 이루어집니다. 그것은 어쩌면 오래된 것일 수도 있습니다. 이것이 무엇을 말하는가? 일종의 국제적인 내전이라고도 할 수 있고 내부화된 몇 겹의 싸움이라고도 할 수 있는 그런 상황이 우리에게 무엇을 전달해 주는가? 내가 겪고 있는 고통이나 문제가 저 멀리 있는 세계와 연결되어 있다, 연루되어 있다라는 것입니다. 하나는. 두 번째는 뭐냐면 우리가 여태까지 우리를 지켜줄 거라고 생각해 왔었던 어떤 기반들이 무너지고 있고, 그리고 그 안에서 우리가 그 제도 안에서 이름만 알았던 마이너리티, 여성, 이방인, 외국인 노동자, 비정규직 이런 사람들의 이름들이 우리는 이름으로서만 알았는데 한 번도 그들과 접촉하려고 하지 않았다. 그 접촉의 감성이 우리에게 있는가라는 것을 질문하게 합니다. 왜 이것을 질문하게 하는가 하면 마이너리티와 접촉한다라는 것은 우리 스스로가 마이너리티가 될 수 있다라는 그런 자각 없이는 불가능하다라고 스스로를 배제합니다.
minority. That's why people do not think about the minority. And the Ssangyong, the vehicle, the layoff case, and also the Sewol-ho case. And I do not need to repeat that story again. And actually, about 19 people died in Japan, and there was the hospital, and the person actually by using this word killed 19 people. This is based on the hate. So we witness this act of hate in many parts of the world. It's because we do not contact. How we can build contact, how we can make the contact with the minority. People hate to be the minority. That's why people do not talk about minority, and people do not want to think about minority. We need to try to contact minority, but it's quite difficult to build a link with the minority. When there is one incident, and after the end of incidents, we should connect at the time before the incident and after the incident. And the incident gives the pain to people, but we should make our effort in order to connect before the incident and after the accident. By doing so, we can understand the dark part. So the minority commune, they have all the problems. They have great challenges. At the very center of the darkness, there is a power because there are so many the complicated power struggles and power mechanism. People do not know against whom they should fight. So, well, the darkness that exists within our mind and within our heart. But I do not want to attempt to change this darkness to brightness, and it's not my main message. And actually, we should think about the darkness and darkness itself. We will have some the twinkling part and glittering part, and I believe that is a context of midnight. And I'd like to talk about the writing and the reasoning. And how is it possible to make a link in the different the timings? And I'd like to talk about the story of the Kai in Okinawa. And there is the U.S. Army base. And well, in order to build the helicopter, the taking off and the landing site. And well, actually, government want to have some construction work, but people there have a strong resistance. At one time, the Japanese government said they are going to stop the construction, but soon after the general election, in 6 hours after the general election, the soldiers and the people came and they start to have these constructions. And people share the story through blog, and people share the pains people had. I'm going to read the articles written in blog. Even though the blockade is a build, but it's not possible to blockade the people. People cannot, be surrounded. In Okinawa, in Tokyo, there was joint demonstrations in two different cities, in two different locations, and there was demonstrations against these constructions. And I believe the screen and the speaker is the main part of the demonstration. And I'd like to show some pictures, but I cannot control this. And the speaker and the screen is a main part and the main tool of demonstrations because the people actually made a phone call and well, the people in Tokyo made a phone call to Okinawa and they delivered the happenings that are taking place in Okinawa through screens and speakers. And that this is the screen. By using this screen, what is taking place in Okinawa, and that is screened in the Shinjuku. I believe many of you visited Shinjuku. Shinjuku's night that is very bright because of the neon sign. So even though the screen is the shown here, well, people cannot see the images very well. But anyhow, this demonstration happened in Tokyo. So this is the microphones, and this the mouse. This is ear actually. So the people desire to listen to what is taking place in Okinawa, and just like the building pipe lines, and we actually build kind of the communication networks. And that guy will talk about this Okinawa case when there is no the ears that will listen to the story. Well, people will lose the sound. People will lose the word, and people will lose the languages. This is not only the case of Japan. I believe even in Songju, where the SAD will be located, and also in Gangjeong, and where the U.S. The army base will be established, and we are going to see same kind of problems. And all these problems, I'd like to ask the second question. So how we can connect the people who are in the different time and the scale. Actually, human act that is quite painful. Well, leading the human act, actually, the instead of I, the you was used.
So there we could feel the dead and pretend to be dead. Due to time constraints, I'll be brief. There's another Yamashiro Shikaku that I put my attention on, and he tries to reproduce the testimony of the victims, but it's not possible. He can't just do it because of emotions, and he tries to reproduce it. However, there is a between space because he just think of the faces of the victims, and I think this is the explicit limitation and also potentiality of listening to and writing the traumatic history, and how we can connect the darkness and another darkness of the minority. That is another question. And from now on, what I will try to convey to you can be a small story, maybe a confidential story, and maybe there will be a part that can never be heard, even if I utmostly try to make it heard. And I will try to send the secret to you. When we talk about listening and writing, well, there are many trials, but there was Moriko Tarahashi in mine in 1960s in Japan. He met women there, and then he made a journal called Anonymous Communication. And all writings there is an act of writing and listening. And it says like this. It was kind of a self-diagnosis through chatter at a wash place. Why was it needed? It can come summarized in 3 days. Women didn't know how to desire. That was why they chat. And secondly, women don't know how to write, and thus they don't know how to express themselves, so they chat. And thirdly, they don't have enough time to write because of domestic chores, and that is why they want to return anonymous and nameless. And in that sense, this is a question of writing and listening, and also this is a question of establishing new relations, and their words are emanating, but they just stopped. They stopped at a moment. And from that stopping moment, I made a connection with the Japanese woman who died in a Japanese park, and I would name her Kay. Well, I heard a story from Uchimo Misako, who is homeless, artist, painter, and activist. And Uchima Misako talked about the woman Kate to me, saying that she was a silent woman living in a park and resisted every institution of hospital and care center, and she just died. And other homeless colleagues treated her differently. And researchers found that she kept writing journals every day about her life of homeless in the park. And I just felt that there was a strong connection between her journal and me. We left the place, and several days after, from Ichimura-san, I received this booklet and kira kira. Kira kira means shiny and sparkly, and he extracted some parts of Kay's book, Kay's journal, and this was used for her to calm her and encouragement to her. And the question of homeless, the issue of homeless, especially that homeless is a woman, if that is, then it is quite rare to talk about it. And it is quite rare that the public puts attention to that fact. However, this woman K resisted hospital and medical care till the last moment. And I had such a feeling to her. Despite of violence, despite of poverty, she tried to her protect her inner value and herself. And there are some points that ask us the value and the meaning of life. And in her journal, she said, I grabbed $5, I mean 500 coins in Japanese yen, and I will make this live as much as I can, and then I will spend it. And have you ever had that kind of thoughts on money? And she kept illuminating on her life. I'm in a cafe, and it feels like I'm in France. And sometimes she feels like she just departs Japan, taking an airplane for 18 hours when she felt big whirlwind that destroys her tent. Maybe that's the limit of life, and the ideology is too far away from my real life. That's what she said in her journal, and that's the point, and that's the impetus that made and enabled art, listen, and write. And she was so much exposed to violence and poverty, but she never wanted to go back to her real life and ordinary life. And she also said in her journal, I'll never adjust to the life. Yes, she returned back to tent, and she became darkness there. And she said, there I have liberty, freedom, and here I don't have freedom. The meaning was very personal, but sociological, but also very emotional. And there was an exhibition organized by women, and that exhibition is depicted here in this booklet. And one of the homeless women group tries to reproduce the Journal of K again in a different way, and because it's the way of emanating the voice of a group, and it is undergoing, and I'm in part of that group too, and I can't give you any specific results, concrete results for now. So I hope that you may have heard my story like a novel, and I don't want you to try to find out the real path, but please bear this in mind. Why do we fear tomorrow? The moment we think that tomorrow will be the same like today, then there will be fear. We find our dignity when we lose dignity, and we dream of language when we suffer from aphasis. Well, maybe that comes from the past. We are in the darkness, but that fact creates a new value. The context in amidst the darkness means darkness in commune and context in darkness and dreaming of writing and listening. That's why we're gathered here. Sometimes weak commune should be waited so that they can flourish themselves, and sometimes we need ears that could hear silence in darkness, and through that we will be able to change the world. And at that intersection, when art meets reality, flourishing imagination will rise. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Mr. Shinjiang. What will follow is the presentation from Fernando and the Hu Han, the curator Hu Fang, actually made a video. So we'd like to present a part of the video in this occasion.
Everyone. Well, thank you, Vina, for inviting me to present, amidst Maria as well, for being here and presenting in the middle of production and preparation process. So I'll try to be also honoring the absence of Hu Fang somehow. It was very nice, the idea of being in conversation with him, who I like very much, but unfortunately he cannot be here. So we thought that one good way to have him here somehow is through a short, I don't know if you can see, of his video. I had the chance to be in Mirror Gardens a couple of years ago, and I think that of making the place and how this site has been built has been very fast. So I think maybe the best way is to look at it through his own video and images. And if I don't know if you want to play it from there, or I have the video as well here. It's a couple of minutes, and then we can comment a little bit. But if you want to play it from here, then maybe the sound as well. Oh yeah, better.
Even 2 minutes. No.
No sound? The video is available online if you want to see more, and then there will be as well in the middle of this month the publication of the book Towards an Unintentional Space, the first Chinese version, in which he will be expanding a little bit on the different architectural designs involved in this project, as well as the construction that took place in the last 3 years. Who himself was interested in learning the natural farming process, that is like a specific technique Interestingly enough, well, this is his garden. Here we see a curator touching a tree, so it's like some contact happening. And I think that the interesting thing for me was that one of his previous videos was referring to a pioneer on biodynamics who is actually active in Austria. And I was thinking on a potential conversation we could have, if he were here, would be about how in this moment we have multiple references that recombine. No? Somehow it's like those specific niches, for example, under water, volcanoes, in which extreme conditions might provide potential experimental forms of art life or life in the arts environment. And I think that it's interesting that he was looking to Western references, like I said, biodynamics, that was influenced by theosophy, and a very specific moment in history in which esotericism and looking to the East was bringing somehow of some feeling of reference of cosmovision in a world, in a Europe that was being shaken by the pre-war times. At the same time, the West looks at the East, and we were exchanging some information about the work of George Chan. George Chan is a professor from Mauritius who developed the dream farm system. And the dream farm system was looking at the ancient millenarian way of cultivating in the Pearl River Delta and other places in ancient China. But somehow something is lost in translation. In this research, I had to deal with many corrupted files of obsolete software that actually didn't allow to interpret the full sense of his teachings and lessons, and how he was praising at the same time the ancient peasant techniques, using as well modern but still affordable, highly sophisticated engineering solutions. And this picture from his personal album is from a Brazilian military base in the state of Rio Grande do Sul, in the time when the Partido dos Trabalhadores, the Workers' Party, was in power. So they invited him to develop a whole system for the, let's say, sustainability of the economical project and strategy that the Workers' Party was in that time projecting for this area of Brazil. Somehow, as I said, we have to reinterpret and rethink on all these different attempts to redesign production systems. Vina was asking me for a PowerPoint. I brought a technical one. No, this just some slides from Professor Cham himself as well, referring to the different references. It's very interesting how he refers at the beginning of his work to the harmonious relationship between heaven, nature or universe, earth as a resource, and people, society. It was as well for him very interesting how the set of values in ancient China was very much related with important ecological, scientifically proved interesting behaviors, like the reuse of all waste. So he made a very relevant critique to the present modern city, characterized by no desirable high speed economic development, high material energy consumption, high waste generation, a little accounting for the ecological consequences of its activities. This is not what China and the third world need. Instead, we should have ecologically sound cities with highly efficient uses of even renewable resources. So he dedicated his whole life to that. Now I started to question myself, then what would be our position as artists? So considering now the kind of considerable gap between cultural production or cultural reproduction, like the culture that allows our societies to reproduce themselves, to also not only survive, but also to develop all the human potentials. As I said, the huge gap with ecological cycles as well as with the economy of the substrate for this activity. What I mean is that, for example, a biennale has its own connection between these three spheres, and another one could be, for example, when we look to George Chan work, how might be built through farm craft production in relation to ecology. In this sense, the techniques of biodynamics, the techniques of George Chan, what Hu Fang was looking at, is a system of production in relation to the ecological cycles. It's like how to make our economy, how to make use of the earth, of the resources, sustainable and profitable. But the question would be to integrate as well the cultural dimension or the potential of reproduction, no? of a new culture that is connecting ecological cycles and economic substrate. In this sense, the role of culture, the role of the artist, could be related with the re-understanding of peasant and indigenous cosmologies, as well as my proposal maybe to think on communities of practice or spaces where the cultural production and the reproduction, the cultural reproduction of the community, is directly connected with these ecological cycles and with an economy coming out from this. This is important because maybe now we could think, okay, maybe the role of art is to try to keep fighting for public subsidies in order to make sure that artists are fairly paid. Well, maybe as well, Hu Fang strategies to create a private economic initiative, a gallery that also has a space that connects with a certain ecosystem, no? That is mirrored garden. So it's also the question of how, as cultural, we have into account the economy substrate. This could lead us to the question of going back to the land. I was working with Maria some time ago in mapping a history and ecology of rural initiatives or rural art initiatives, no, in Europe and in the world actually. And I discovered, for example, how from 1830 to 1910 there were 3,000 artists in Europe living in more than 100 rural art colonies. Very often they were 100, 200 artists living together, working in relation to the rural. But the question is also that they were not there necessarily leaving the established urban art centers. They were there producing because they were part of a general movement of people and artifacts that characterized the 19th century process of modernization, that in which the artists were caught up. It means that the artists were still connected with the urban audience in the sense that they were bringing that longing for a world lost in the industrial modern times. They sent paintings to exhibit in the cities, and they also placed myths on rural life and locations. The villages would attract visitors in the increasing social phenomena of leisure that was happening at the time. And then some of the artists were like colony hoppers. That means that spend 1 week in one colony and then another. And it is more or less calculated or estimated 1% of locals participating in those art colonies. No? So sometimes they painted the locals as if they were pre-industrial peasant or fisher folk, imagined characters targeting an urban middle-class audience, and conjured up agrarian idyls whose alleged authenticity was guaranteed by the eyewitness of the status of artist in the field. Sometimes these myths related with regional and national motifs that could lead to the whole discourse of maybe another turn of the screw in conservatism. That means all the essentialist values of the rural pure rootness of certain people, certain folk. This, of course, in Europe was well, showing its more evil face in the case of totalitarian regimes and fascist regimes. And it made that at the beginning of the, more or less at the beginning of the 20th century, the artists were no longer there. They kind of escaped from that logic of delivering to the bourgeois middle class what they wanted, and they moved to the cities. No, they were no longer in those utopian communities, as this of Tolstoy, and in very rare cases, they were depicting rural motifs, like the visionary projection of the farmer by Malevich, or the peasant women by Malevich as well. In some cases, farmer artists like Miro, in the moment of the Civil War, were creating an economy based on the distribution as well of, in this case, like stamps. No? But I mean, it was kind of a clear insertion of the artist in a popular front, and in relation with creating an economical substrate for that action. In this moment, what I think is that, thank you. Yeah. In this moment, what I think is that it's more increasingly evident contemporary art's shortcoming. So there is like we see the continued efforts to escape art as we know it. The now familiar emphasis on public participation, non-art, smuggling, deterritorialization, in-betweenness, evenhood, indeterminacy. This is what, like Malik proposed for art to have a substantial and credible traction on anything beyond or larger than itself. It is necessarily decisive to exit contemporary art, and therefore to renounce contemporary art's logic of escape at the same time. I wondered, what can this art other to contemporary art's paradigm of escape could be? What other kind of social structure and distribution of power than the prevalent in contemporary art would support it? What should an art that is not contemporary art do? In the beginning of the 20th century, the avant-garde artist had to reject the pastoral depiction of the rural to satisfy the bourgeois taste, and needed a movement to move back, in this case, a eruption in the city, Dadaism and so on. Maybe today it's necessary to engage with a deep art practice and escape from institutional art and some sense a loop, paralyzed loop of self-ruminating cultural capital, what it requires and it demands, and maybe move back to other space of production. I'm not going to depict what could be the rural today, because trends we can see, for example, robotization, we see individualization, we see a lot of pressure from increasing private economical agents into how land is used, how food is produced. But it's, of course, very different from Asia to Europe or other parts of the world. Nevertheless, I was looking in that work we did to how artists that go to back or work in a rural context, what they are developing, what they are experimenting with, what they are opening a space to. And I remember this interview with Patrick Overton, Savannah Barrett, some artist somewhere in rural Canada. And then when they were asked why you came to work here, they said, the first answer is the one I think most of us doing this work will say. I'm an artist and I wanted company. I write poetry and it was the way I discovered my voice and what I believed and what I wanted. I wanted to share this discovery with those around me. What I didn't knew was that as I worked with individuals while they would find their voice, I was doing so much more. We were in the process of becoming citizens who were making communities with the art. We can't expel all of our political capital worrying about whether or not we are at the table. We don't have time to worry about that. I believe we are at the table. We are our communities most equipped and able to convene people, gather interest parties, break through traditional political economic barriers, and well, getting people together, play, and make a difference in our community. We are the voice enablers and value generators. We are central to everything that is going on. They aren't just the mad ravings of a cultural edgeliner. So maybe let's connect with the question of the minor. 2 minutes. The minor, the notion of the silent, the invisible everyday practice. And yeah, what we try, for example, in the project of Inland, as it has been developing, and also in collaboration with Casco, for example, inspired with the work that Lorca was doing with the mobile theater that brought kind of specific forms of culture to the rural, and mobile method in which we worked in the area where Lorca was, and discovered the need to create those kind of transparent pre-emergency learning sites. So in this case, we are recovering a village in the north of Spain, places that have a rich and amazing culture in itself, and as spaces of reference as well. And I think that just maybe for a moment, the work here, Lament of the Nude, responds in its format to the context both of the Biennale and the place itself that dragged my attention. The place itself, it's one of the last rice fields of Gwangju, and it's run by a community who actually very successfully prevented it to be destroyed by a highway. So I've been there like around 2 months, and then different moments in the seasonal cultivation cycle. Very amazed on how the group come together and develop their own, for example, rituals regarding these different moments and process. So now we are working on making kind of a performance in which we are talking about how we relate with nature, a little bit of tribal relation, because the price to pay to keep this land was to parkify it somehow. So it's between animism and animatronics. And yeah, it's hard work. I just managed to escape for a moment, or a little long moment, and we have rehearsals. We are learning in the process. It's like making, for example, workshops with natural dyes master to make the different, with indigo, different clothing for the different characters. And I think that, yeah, that also is good that I'm here, maybe because in the time I'm here, they are actually giving life, no, to all that could be a vague idea of an artist, no, and trying to drag people into this idea, but they are kind of owning, no, what could be this process of maybe community that not only produces with the land, but also has a strong cultural production that generates value, and that it's like becoming a resilient group in the sense of practicing direct democracy, owning public space and owning commons, and then as well developing forms that could be important in these days of rising more conservative maybe drifts, no, of populations that have felt very far from what avant-garde and contemporary art does. So what happens in rural England when they vote Brexit, that they felt excluded from a whole discourse of cultural important empowerment, no, as well. So this is what the message mostly, no, care, patience, observation, humbleness. Thank you so much.
So as our last speaker, shall we have Andrea Phillips on the stage? And welcome her. No?
I forgot to say that tomorrow you don't have the program, no?
I will do it.
I think I left in a place. No,
No, I'm fine. No, yes. I put your little...
well done.
I have this. My only image. Hello. Hello. I know we're running late, and everybody's been terribly patient, and everybody in this room knows much more than I do about what I'm about to talk about. So I have 3 things to say before I start reading a paper. Apologies. It's the boring academic moment of the evening. So the first thing is, I thought maybe I could cut down my paper but it would be unfair to the translators, who are doing a brilliant job. Thank you very much, translators. So it will be unfair to them because they're reading what I'm reading in English. So I can't cut it down, sorry. Second thing to say is that I wrote this paper, as Binna indicated at the beginning in her introduction to today. I've written this, and most of the things that I've written over the past 15 years under the influence of a series of artists and organizations that I've worked with closely, many of whom are in this room. And on that level, I'd very much like to thank Maria and Binna for inviting me here, and all the co-workers of the organization that have put this event and the biannual together, because it's through working with people like Binna and Maria that I process ideas and thoughts. And on that thought, and beautifully and symbiotically, as I was going for a cup of coffee just now, Dmitry Valensky handed me the 38th issue of the Stodelat newspaper, which is all about reorganizing and reimagining houses of culture and looking at them historically. And of course, there are many people that are looking at histories of art institutions that I think are really important and really tie in with some of the things that I'm going to try and say today, including Fernando Garcia Dori. is keen, as many of us know, on para-institutions. I'm not going to talk about para-institutions. I'm going to talk about the institutions we already have. So I thought I'd be dumb and take literally the idea of today's session. What are all the contributing factors? Many of them have been mentioned already. Fundraising, having meetings, hustling for work, buying, loaning, persuading, getting visas. I added that one in because it was mentioned earlier on today. Controlling budgets, managing budgets, traveling, organizing travel for others on this biannual, transporting goods, installing, budgeting, negotiating, making friends, sharing space, researching, developing thoughts and ideas with other people, learning, making, writing, thinking, filming, editing, collaborating, hosting, eating with others, drinking with others, and I hear quite a lot of that has been going on as well. I missed it all so far. Cleaning, and that's a special, I dropped cleaning in there as a special ode to Casco in Utrecht, who have spent a lot of time thinking about the value of cleaning. Finding the money to pay for studio rent, buying materials, planning formats, deciding on materials, maintaining a studio, dividing resources, working at high speed, organizing to tight deadlines, managing people, managing expectations, managing audiences, managing commissioners, managing sponsors, managing patrons, managing state officials, managing tempers. Gathered here today by Maria Lind, Binna Choi, and their co-workers are experts from all over the world. That's you guys. Your expertise is in making things and getting those things, be they objects, images, sounds, events, ideas, exchanges, discussions, into circulation, be that by making public displays, raising money to support yourself and making public displays, raising money to support yourself and others in their making, gathering people together, moving things between sites, lobbying powerful people to listen, convincing those with different lives and communities to come forward and join in, caring for those people around you, those that you employ, those that employ you, those that have no employment, those that are poor, those that care themselves, those that don't care at all. Significantly, Binna and Maria mentioned this in the introduction today, significantly the scale of your work is small to medium, to hedge our bets. So the scale of your work is small, in that you individually do not have a large set of employees or vast gallery or event spaces, even though you may work in and with such institutions on a more or less regular basis. Thank you, that's fantastic. You are gathered here today on the premise that something about your scale, Maria called it the minor, is not only important in terms of artistic and curatorial production, offering opportunities for experimentality that larger institutions cannot, or we think cannot. Sometimes they can, sometimes they cannot. And you may or may not consider yourself an institution yourself or be perceived as such by others, but also because there is something socially and politically significant about your scale. We would like to think. This talk will hope to open up questions about scale, sociality, and labor. What is the relation between the visible and the invisible laboring you do, the scale at which you work, its effects on the broader context of contemporary culture, and the possibility of collaboration, of solidarity? Further, how does the work of managing and organizing produce unaccounted, how does the work of managing and organizing and producing, I'll do it again. How does the work of managing and organizing produce unaccounted value, and how could a committed investigation of management, of organization, help to proliferate and expand the ways in which we might reconsider each other, communicate, and work together? What does your managerial labor involve? What are the forms of labor that join us together, both the visible and the invisible, the valued and the devalued, or even unvalued? In discussing what all the contributing factors might be, we must begin to imagine, I'm just going to do this, that's easier for me. We must begin to imagine the spatial and social power we have, alongside the powers of symbolic and actual value. We need to repurpose these, or as the situationists would have said, if we think back to our romantic past, we need to détourne these ideas. Across a structure like a biannual, as well as in an increasing amount of museums and galleries, there is a range of value sets in operation. By value sets, I mean a conglomeration or an entanglement of beliefs, aesthetic ambitions, political constraints, financial imperatives, opportunities, social networks, funding structures, institutional relationships, and personal desires. There will be some artists here whose work is made to be shown in galleries and is object, film, or image-based, for example. There will be some artists whose work is highly ephemeral, based on exchanges with present and absent people, committed to a place far away, translated for us here. We work together, and the differences between us are often misunderstood, especially the differences advanced through our relationship with financial and symbolic value. Across a structure like a biannual, there are some artists who are represented by galleries, who live and make work on the percentage of sales income they receive when their work is sold by their gallerist, although Walid Rad would tell us that would only exist for 40 months. Walid, you can ask Walid about that data set later on. There are artists that live and work with what is often politely termed a portfolio career, if career is the term that we should apply here, working across teaching, being commissioned, being shown, working in a bar, etc., etc. There are many artists who work across these two models. There are gallerists here who live in complex financial and social webs, working at all ends of the art economy, trying to support a group of artists they believe in, often the term that is used, or conversely, trying to sell work by artists who they represent for profit. Also working in the public also there are people working in the public sector, in bars, in schools, in education, all forms of investment, all producing sets of values. There are curators here who work independently, in and out of institutions, trying to develop complex projects with a fragile set of collaborations which fall in and out of place on a regular basis. There are curators here who work for state-run institutions, increasingly laboring to fundraise from the private sector. There are also, perhaps, people here who run private museums and galleries. Our value sets are mixed. They are heterogeneous, contradictory, and often politically hostile to each other, in the sense that we might value organizational alterity, but our governance processes and our fundraising strategies mean working with people whose value sets are entirely different to our own. We live in and on productive, if unsettling, compromise. Why do we feel so alone within this conglomeration? Surely this art world that we have made has another value set to offer, one based on solidarity and infrastructural collaboration. Is there a way to work that outlies the competitive insecurity we adopt, to work as a community of differentiations? We have an advantage. We are relatively unimportant to global power, even as we advertise and disseminate its values through our current structures of work. Even the most successful artists and museum directors amongst us know that we are marginal. In the West, at least, our desperate and ongoing attempt to render positive our financial contribution to GDP, to gross domestic product. This is something that is constantly happening in the States and in the Anglo-Saxon world at least, which is the cultural sector desperate to prove to the government, in order to continue its funding, that it is worth X percentage of GDP. Even those of us with a steady income can recognize that our marginal and marginalized practices of social and aesthetic labor, the countless years of skill development across fields, and in the most extraordinarily diverse practices, our reading, our mapping, our administration, our financial ingenuity, our negotiations, our patience, our parties, our organizations, these factors can contribute far more than the psychosis of individualism, elitism, and meritocracy that otherwise threatens to swallow our labor and our values. So I have a plan, albeit one that might be criticized for its profound naivety. First, we need to enter a period of analysis, and I don't mean the psychoanalytic kind, although that might be helpful. I think we could do this in about 5 years. It continues to surprise me that whilst the area of labor we all work in consistently produces objects, images, events, etc., that are hyper-conscious of the inequities, divisions, and power flows of contemporary life, we rarely examine in enough detail and for sustained enough a period the inequities, divisions, marginalizations, and power flows in our own sector. And this could be the beginning of something here. Or that when we do so periodically, eventally, and not in a systematic way that suggests and mobilizes some form of application. This is, of course, circuitous. We are immobilized from such work due to the nature of our periodicity, the way that we work periodically, eventally. There are, of course, individuals and organizations here that, often working in precarious circumstances, do build networks of solidarity and equality, using the processes and productions of art to help in the structuring of their thoughts and actions. I think Fernando was just describing something like that just now. There are many people here who work both individually and collectively, sometimes by choice, sometimes through necessity, to develop new registers of value. There are investments that are long-term, and sustaining them takes up all physical, conceptual, political, and financial resource that individuals and organizations that have collectivized have. There are many of us. I propose that we must manage and organize a stronger, more sustained, and more careful working life for ourselves. We need to learn to manage across our projects. and in this produce a blueprint that we are uniquely positioned to imagine, structure, put into practice, and maintain. Uniquely, because we're small, we often go acknowledged, unacknowledged, and we are relatively weak. A blueprint for how to work together. I'm getting my 5 minutes sign. Oop. This will involve radical change. It will involve not simply pragmatic change to organizational structures and hierarchies, but also political and psychic changes to territorial boundaries, subject-object relations, relationalities per se, to real and imagined communities. We work in and around, through and for institutions that already structure our labor, and not simply in terms of our physical and temporal commitments, but also our value systems. A museum, however radical, is a site developed through a history that resists fundamental change. A biennial is the same, its temporality governed by intense, even manic labor, followed by an opening that must be understood both in socially constricted and financially focused terms. Our progress towards another way of working, our ecstasis, is developed through these and other institutions, but is developed at the moment in event form, through the highs and lows, the finitudes of a project. We come together to celebrate, to learn, to take pleasure, but can we really work together on a sustained level? Some here, sorry, translations. What we know as the art world is a microcosm of many modes of contemporary management and organization. It has hierarchies and power clusters. It instigates competition and self-absorption, as well as crippling doubt and self-criticism. It produces deep, joyful, and intellectual pleasure. It produces objects and subjects of vast financial and symbolic value. It has a trading system that is majoritively undisclosed. It gathers intelligent, sophisticated, careful, and ambitious people. It produces friendships. It produces spectacular animosities. It produces loyalties and spectacular disloyalties. It has an international network of people and places, and this network grows. The artwork is necessarily avaricious and predatory in its current structure. It needs to feed on new territories, images, and people to survive. And of course, this is an economic structure. The biennial is one outcome of this microcosmic model of what otherwise can be recognized without surprise as a liberal capitalist enterprise. But these structures, these patterns, these lines between us, these occasional commitments formed through the work and the sociality that are so difficult to sustain are also, or could also be, building blocks. After our analytic period, in which we wean ourselves away from competition, meritocracy, and mutual distrust, so perhaps it might take a little bit longer than 5 years, we could then, those of us who wanted to, commit to a longer operational network in which we foreground not only alternative value sets, but of the alternative assemblages of laboring. A congregate art world, like a congregation, like the para-institutions suggested by Fernando, but on a larger, more authoritative scale, a scale that claims and takes responsibility for its own aggregate power. And that power will only be formed through aggregation. The reason I'm so bold as to suggest this is that as an academic and a friend, I see all these alternative values either latent or articulated in your work. I also see you struggle to stay afloat. I see the huge financial battles and struggles to operate within a systematic managerialism that does not fit the values to which you subscribe. Recently, I have been involved in a British, I'm actually going to cut this. I was going to talk about the project How to Work Together, which I've been involved in. Emily Pethick is one of the representatives here from the showroom gallery, was involved in too, was fundamental to, but I'm going to skip it because I'm running out of time. But if anybody wants to talk, I was going to present it as an example of bad practice. But I won't, Emily. Where are you? I mean, bad practice in a good way, but we can talk about it later. Okay, I think Emily would agree with me. Anyway, so we can also draw on the work of feminist and post-colonial thinkers and activists who have recognized across decades the role that gender and race play in the formation of hierarchies of power within organizations. But critically, we need to acknowledge that this psychic and political shift from what Mark Fisher calls managerialism to what many scholars now call critical management goes against the grain of previous generations of activists and political theorists, many of whom argued for an anti-organizational politics, a creative anarchism resistant to forms of possessive value formation. So I've skipped a bit, but to kind of trace what I'm talking about here, histories of kind of radical philosophy, including those of Deleuze and Guattari, who were mentioned by Maria at the end, have been opposed, and there's a leftist tradition within Western philosophy of opposing the managerial and the organizational. I'm saying we have to, and that will come up to Judith Butler and Laurent Berlon and a whole bunch of people that are incredibly important to my thinking and probably to your me. However, I think we need to shift that. We need to shift away from that kind of anarcho, anti-organizational thinking and processing and aestheticization of power and politics towards something that takes up the managerial and the organizational that would produce aggregate power if we did so. And I'm drawing here, as I said before, on Mark Fisher, whose writing has recently looked at the difference between managerialism and management per se. Okay, instead, we need to become better managers, better collaborators, and better institutional builders. Idea of retraining ourselves to be structured organizationally across our sector really work. Build a language around the methodologies of organizational collaboration as a political and aesthetic device, just as previously conceptual art and feminism and its art did. This gives us an opportunity to, and post-colonial thought as well, this gives us an opportunity to rethink and reorganize the micro and macro politics, and I'm currently more interested in the macro politics than the micro politics. There's been enough said about micro politics, in my view. So it gives us an opportunity to reorganize the macro politics of what commonly constitutes the art world. It gives us an opportunity to take action in favor of the alternative instigation of modes of work, collaboration, exchange and support, franchised through a global network of practitioners working at a local level. Reimagine, instead of what my colleague and the artist Jason E. Bowman would say as the problem of de-imagination, let's reimagine this world and the language we use to describe it and its histories. Instead of performance, for example, we could prioritize conversation. Action, we could insist on financial transparency. Instead of institutional critique, we could work on egalitarian reorganization of opportunity for staff and guests. Instead of intervention, we could work on who makes the decisions and who does the cleaning. The context is half the work, that famous artist placement group phrase. We could produce with people who live and work here inform us more than we can inform ourselves. Instead of installation, we could work on factors, and so on. Personally, I'm ready for this, as my body and my brain can't live our contradictions much longer. You are already ahead of me here. Let's produce alternative power. Read this.
So here next to me, Muhammad Salami, who's going to moderate the conversation with Andrea and Tiong Shin and Fernando. There are several more seats on the front rows. To come closer. People are waiting for.
I need the notes I made for you. This anymore is the last section.
Can I just take a picture?
Okay, so we should start because we started late and then we had a lot of time already, sort of like we're behind. I guess few minute break is like this. We can just like tolerate it, but no break. Otherwise, I'm gonna play music. So if you guys gonna chat, I'm gonna play music. Yeah, see, okay. So I'm gonna start by reading this. I'm gonna start by reading this quote from Wittgenstein, which actually, like your presentation, the unfolded. This is what it reminded me. He says, okay, if you guys want to talk, you can leave and talk outside because we're gonna have a serious conversation here, okay? So you either stay and talk, listen, or you go out and talk, okay? Because I'm not gonna put up with it. What we have to mention in order to explain the significance, I mean the importance of a concept, are often extremely general facts of nature. Such facts are hardly ever mentioned because of their great generality. So your presentation in a way listed, we all already know, but they're so second natured and they're so pushed back behind that we don't even think how like long this list is, and also how they all relate to each other. And then of course there's a relationship between what you guys did in terms of like your examples, but also the fact that I was kind of like happy and not surprised, but you know, we've never had a serious conversation for me to know what kind of art world you think of, to bring up Sohail Malik. And then Andrea has worked, and I think you still work with Sohail, right? Because Sohail is back in Goldsmith. So it was like, it was interesting. And I've worked with Sohail, and I worked with like like those ideas for a while now, from 2013 and on. So like has been like central to my ways of thinking. But rather than going over some of those, I was going to give you guys a different problem that really relates to it, right? So now, and I want to do this because I think it will enrich the conversation, even though it might make you think like, why are we talking about this? So let's go with this experiment. So I was thinking of, you guys all you might not, but we remember Cold War, right? And one of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Do you remember Cold War?
78. I don't know.
Yeah, you don't remember Cold War really, but one of the the name was what? One of the contributing factors. Speaking of contributing factors to Cold War, was the useless, stupid military project Star Wars, right? So as US and its allies started to spend money on on Star Wars, it was this major project that was going to sort of like use the space technology to sort of like destroy the missile system of the enemy, and the Soviet Union had to keep up with this expenditure and keep up with this infrastructure, right? But really, they were in no way able to compete with the United States and its allies in terms of financing and printing money and creating value and credit to put into this system. So basically, people who study the collapse of the Cold War, of course they talk about Afghanistan and war and all that, but they realize how the obsession of the Soviet leaders to kind of like come up with their own Star Wars and put money into it was one of the ways. And even though Star Wars project was a complete useless failure, it has a really secondary use that they had not even thought of. Those who thought of the Star Wars system had never thought that the Soviets in this way rather than in a direct war confrontation. Now, look at the global contemporary art. I feel like we're dealing with another kind of like technology as such, in which the Western world is kind of forcing the rest of the world to think and produce art in its own ways. So then all these countries, all these blocks, all these competitors have to sort of like think of cultural production and art production in the same terms and create same types of infrastructure and put money into it. It's almost like a low-level cultural war or cultural, colonization, right? You can think of, right? And sort of like bankrupt Russia, bankrupt China, bankrupt all sorts of other ways of thinking about what cultural production is, or at least force them to meet the West at the same table, which is the table of contemporary art. Now, this analogy, of course, does not follow all the way, like doesn't scale down all the way from a thought or concept down to the material substrate, because actually your presentation shows that like Cold War all the way down, it starts in a military room and it ends with like the officers in like military, right? Whereas here we might start with some on the high level, which is kind of like could be seen as realism, but as it scales down and become more local, you're dealing with really people who really want actually good stuff that has nothing to do with this general other objective or unconscious objective that's going on at the top. And hence is the power of contemporary art actually to actually subvert this project and try to do something else with it. Think of it as like an inevitability that like somehow in the last 20 years, especially after the end of Cold War, been able to convince even its enemies that this is what contemporary art and this is how you should to this table. Even like enemies like Iran, China, Russia, they all understand that contemporary art is very important and they have to participate in it, put money in it, support it. And that's why I think the only time I came into disagreement with you was when you said that global power is not interested in us. But I think that's not true. Actually, they're interested in us because contemporary art at the very meta global level has this function. The problem I was going to give you guys. And this all ties into what you were saying, because we've moved away from those days, and I heard that from Doug Ashford yesterday, that like right in the middle of right before the demonstrators were like, they started shooting demonstrators, the okay came from the American embassy actually. Like the American embassy gave the Korean authorities that like, we're not gonna object to this. Have to go in and start shooting people, do what you need to do to clean this up. So we've moved away from that direct model of control to this more sort of like diverse ways of the hegemon trying to have traction on the peripheries. So in this world, so I'm not a pessimist. I'm even more optimist than Sohail. So I really think as you come down at this local level, there's a lot that can get done, right? So how, I mean, all the elements you mentioned are great, but how can we to a more sort of like, how can we use this space to go against this general to colonize culturally and to hegemonize what contemporary art means and what art is today?
Does anybody want to go before me? A long question. I'm not sure it's a question. But okay, let me just pick a few things out of it. First of all, we will have to retain the disagreement about us being weak and unimportant to global power. You're right, contemporary art is a form of economic, infrastructural colonization and hegemonization. This is a kind of fact that has been recognized the world over. What's interesting to me is, although we recognize it, it's not stopped being done. For instance, as many people know, I helped work on the 2013 Istanbul Biennial, and what was very interesting there was the lack of cognizance between the biennial and the protests of its rendition of cultural capital within the city itself. And this has happened many other places, and it might be happening in Gwangju as we speak right now. Maybe you would be able to tell us about that. But so first of all, I think that we are weak and relatively unimportant in terms of scales of global capital. I mean, if you read somebody like Saskia Sassen, she can produce the data that will suggest this. Secondly, so that's one thing. Secondly, just trying to get into your question, I don't think that it's bad stuff at the top and good stuff at the local. I think there's very good stuff at the top if we're talking like Blue Chip or something like that. I think there are artists that are working, who are making very profound and extraordinarily critical and sophisticated objects and images that are circulating within that system. So one of the reasons that very broadly my argument is, rather than setting up, we work with what we've got, and we induce, we better. I mean, I'm talking on one level. My colleague and friend, Anna Graham, Serpentine, attempted to union time gallery's workforce while she was there over a period of, I don't know, about 6 years, a highly successful in Hyde Park in London, but it has something like, I think now almost 90% of its funding comes from private capital, which is normal in Western infrastructures now. And she found it very difficult. There were lots of blocks all the way along the way, including by people who could have been advantaged by being in a union. Anyway, that's an aside. So I don't think there's bad at the top and good at the bottom. I don't think every rural project, sorry, I didn't mean rural Indians, but I don't think, I don't mean yours. You know, I think there are plenty of really dreadful, rustic projects being funded by arts organizations all over the world that produce shit and are used as cultural capital in just the same way as biennials are used. So I think it's a much more complex picture than that. So I think that's one of the things I would pick up. Why I think we need to link up. I think the most important thing I was trying to say, or I think is important, was the concept that we need to think about this concept of aggregation or conglomeration or joining up. it's very difficult because we're paranoid about these terms network, because network, of course, is something that has been capitalized. We understand the network as something that is profoundly economized, financialized, manipulative, blah, 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 blah. But actually, how can we reclaim concepts of network that allow us to do our things, but actually aggregate the set of powers that we have? You know, you put all the small things together and you make something big. Just said that.
Do you want to add something?
I forgot the question. What was the question? No, it's fine. No, I just wanted to say that maybe we should consider that it's obvious art is not what it appears in its current state. It's a faculty and it's not something that belongs to a context of elite, no? Although it happens to be. And I think that the challenge is for us as artists, because we somehow are super specialized cultural producers in the sense of visual or intellectual codes and conceptual and so on. So how we go in dialogue to this source, to this faculty, no? And let it be enriched and opened by other languages. Speak now.
Do you want to?
예, 저는 제가 여기 왜 와 있는지 계속해서 질문하게 됩니다. 왜냐하면 계속해서 예술에서 여러 가지 요소들에 대해서 I'm sorry. Actually, you can use this. Maybe two. Channel 2, I think. 2. 저는 제가 왜 이 자리에 와 있는지 계속해서 질문해야 했습니다. 저는 예술가도 아니고, 그리고 이런 작은 그 예술 공간들을 엮는 그런 사람도 아닙니다. 근데 저를 부른 이유가 있겠죠. 최빈나 큐레이터가 굉장히 귀엽고도 강한 말로 저한테 접촉이 무엇인가에 대해서 함께 이야기하는 자리다라고 이야기했습니다. 그래서 이곳에 왔습니다. 그리고 그 안드레아 씨의 발표랑 아까 그 예술가들이 농촌에 가서 함께하는 이야기를 보면서 이분들이 생각하고 있는 접촉이라는 집안과 내가 생각하고 있는 접촉의 집안이 조금 다를 수도 있지만 함께 이야기해야 하는구나라는 생각도 들었습니다. 그러니까 제가 생각했었던 접촉은, 물론 저도 그런 일을 합니다. 맨날 편지를 쓰고 성격을 죽이면서 사람들의 케어를 하고 뭐 이렇게 심포지엄을 조직하고, 그리고 하나의 꼬면 안에 들어가서도 수많은 가사일과 음식을 만드는 일과 그런 일들을 합니다. 그럴 때 생각했어요. 어떻게 하면 이 일들이 그냥 그 자체로 가치일 수 있을까? 그래서 안드레아 씨의 이야기가 굉장히 좋았습니다. 이게 글로벌한 것과 자본과 깊게 연결되어 있다고 하더라도 그 안에서 이야기하는 그 사람들의 어둠에 대해서 우리가 어떻게 가치로 이야기할 수 있을까라는 문제를 다시 생각했습니다. 그래서 굉장히 기뻤어요. 그리고 발표 들으면서 마지막에 인내라는 말씀을 하셨습니다. 그 예술가들이 하나의 커뮤니티 안에 들어가서 두 달 동안 작업했을 때 마지막으로 인내라는 말이 나왔습니다. 사실 저는 오늘 제가 했었던 이야기를 할 때도 이 어려움을 느낍니다. 제가 말하고 싶은 접촉은 오히려 그런 부분인데요. 예술가들이 현장과 개입할 때, 현장과 접촉할 때 어떤 문제들이 일어나는가, 어떤 윤리성들을 가져야 하는가, 내가 오늘 했었던 그 이야기들이 혹시 내가 그것을 이야기함으로써 여기서 그냥 소비해버리는 것은 아닐까, 이것이 어떤 울림을 만들어야 할 텐데, 이런 고민들을 가져왔습니다. 예술가들이 현장과 결합할 때 늘 그런 고민들을 가지고 있을 거라고 생각해요. 거기에 물론 자본도 때로는 필요하고, 때로는 행정직원들과 굉장히 싸워야 하는 일들도 생깁니다. 심지어 집회를 할 때도 행정직원과 싸웁니다. 우리 언제부터 집회할 거니까 뭐 도로교통 뭐 유지해달라 뭐 이런 식의 것들을 합니다. 어떤 작은 공간에들도 그런 것들은 있지요. 그렇기 때문에 그런 문제들 우리가 어떻게 함께 고민할 수 있을까? 단순히 어떤 현장이나 어떤 작은 마을이나 이런 곳에 들어가서 그것을 예술화하는 것이 아니라 그 순간의 표현이라는 것 자체가 어떻게 새로워질 수 있는가 이런 거를 함께 고민할 수 있으면 좋겠다고 생각해서 여기에 왔습니다. 예, 그게 서로의 울림을 잘 만들어갈 수 있을지 잘 모르겠습니다. 그리고 보다 아주 근본적으로 정말 왜 접촉해야 하는가. 들리지 않는 소리들이 있고 혼자서는 풀 수 없는 문제들이 있고 그러니까 왜 접촉해야 하는가라는 것을 지금 더 많이 고민해야 한다고 생각합니다.
If I understood are we going to open this up also to the, yeah. To the audience, I mean to people here as well. If I understood your question right, the question is why would we network with each other if actually there are people that aren't being, that are being ignored by the system, like the story of the female artist that you told. Is that right?
I can say yes. Yeah.
Okay,
But
thank
she
you.
used the word context rather than network. Context.
Context.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, context.
Contact. Okay, yeah. Okay. So, I mean, it's a very good question. So, but for me, there are many important projects that are going on that really look and deal with questions. For instance, I mean, it would be crass of me to say directly with homeless artists, but there are many projects that are dealing with questions of homelessness, that are dealing with questions of marginalization, of racism, of gender inequality, that are happening at all scales and with all budgets. But my concern with them is they are what I call periodic or eventual. So they only last for how long? I mean, inland is a different thing because you've been going for a long time, but mainly people only can sustain projects. I'm looking for Big Van der Pol here because I know they're here and they're also people that sustain projects, but mainly people are unable to sustain projects. And the reason they're unable to sustain projects is not simply, I mean, it's largely to do with the way in which the financial negotiations and dramaturgies are organized within art, not only art, but very specifically within contemporary art. But it's also because we're taught to want that. And we love going to the opening and kind of going, we've done it, hooray, we've been nice to the black people and the homeless people, you know, and the people from the other side of the world. So that's okay now, we've done it, yeah? And actually, we all know that that's politically unaffordable. Well, I hope we all know that. And but in order to change it, we don't simply need to change the structures, but this is why I talked about values, but we also need to rethink art education, the ways in which we motivate people to want to become producers that use culture. I like your phrase, like using art as a kind of faculty or, you know, something that can be used as part of a kind of negotiation of other things. But we can't take any political project seriously, I don't think, if it doesn't think about its sustenance across a much longer period of time. And well, I mean, the network doesn't, you know, not everybody has to make the same project. I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying that one of the ways we could sustain things over a longer period of time is by passing things, is by keeping things together, is by moving things around. Now, there are a number of organizations already in play in this room, like, for instance, the Cluster Network, like, for instance, Common Practice that Maria talked about earlier, like the way that Casco works. You know, there are probably projects here like the way that Inland works. So there are people that are trying to do that, like the way that Big Van der Pol works. So there are organizations that are attempting to do that. The question is, how it's really complicated. How do we mobilize different forms, different faculties? You know, how does a video installation like the ones that I've seen very quickly on the second floor of the Gwangju Biennial today, how does that participate in that kind of sustenance? Because I think it can, but I think we need to formulate that in quite complex ways, and that's what I'm trying to do.
Now, if I get a chance to, like, because I put forth like a long sort of like question. So what I would like to add to that is like part of this figuring out is not just figuring out the logistics or how we would work together or how, but what will be politically gained both at a local but also international geopolitical level. What can be gained from all these things that we do, from all and these new ways of figuring out that we do, recognizing that we have this political limit because we are limited by how local authorities, governmental agencies, private sector has this interest in us that could be benevolent or it could not be benevolent, and we have to rely on it. But it's really essential to keep a sort of like a larger picture in mind and try to make sure that you don't fall into these like intended traps that these powerful parts of the network have put in front of you. And sometimes it's possible, sometimes it's impossible, I think. But I mean, that's what keeps somebody like me who's been kind of like reading and talking to Suhail still interested in art, because a lot of people after encountering your work, you know what I mean, tainted love alone is enough to read it and just go like, okay, I'm just going to change my field and go do something else besides contemporary art, right? But that's what makes us still interested, you know, that like despite all of that, we still want to participate and we still want to transform it and we still want to use it for some other larger, better purpose. So do you, I mean, I'm not asking you for solutions. Yeah, totally. Let's open it up to people. So we have extra mics if somebody wants to add to the conversation or ask a question from the participants.
Well, thank you, all the contributors. You were also the contributing factors. I would like to ask you, Andrea, to elaborate a little bit more on how you could imagine that this alternative conglomerate form of power could look like. I imagine that you have some sort of seed of an idea of the shape and form, etc. of it. And if so, can you please share that with us?
Okay, well, it is very much a seed, but I think we need to build on existing networks that exist. I think we need to I guess my thought is that we should if we begin to reinvent the language, this is why I kind of ended with talking about the kind of languages we've inherited from conceptualism, from you know, let's call it the avant-garde. How can we repurpose those languages into things that are more conceptually and socially and politically related to some of the questions like how do you organize your workforce, for instance. I mean, I would like to get to the point where we rethink what public funding for the arts is, for instance, and we rethink the ways in which we might distribute public funding where there is public funding. Of course, there are many places where there's no public funding at all. In ways that are based on sets of questions of parity. and questions of organizational structure, for example. And also, I mean, I said it was big and it will take more than 5 years, but I think that there's also, there's a set of things that divide us, which is to do with the way that we're competitively inscribed. Yeah? So we're competitively inscribed. Even those of us that work for in an old village in Andalusia, okay? We're competitively inscribed, that's him. We're competitively inscribed to make our farming project different and better than somebody else's farming project. In the same way that we're competitively inscribed to make our video installation better and different from somebody else's video installation. And I think until we can tackle that in some way, and it's a fundamental curatorial problem, Maria, then we can't move forward with forms of solidarity, which is not to say that one farming project might not be different from another farming project. But there need to be some ways in which the structures we invent allow us to kind of go, okay, so your farming project is in Andalusia and my farming project, or our farming project in Andalusia and our farming project is in Gwangju, the remaining rice field. So if we find some connections between them, then we can work it out. But it's also, for instance, I mean, a practical level, the International Biennial Association or organization, or whatever it's called, should be utilized to make things work between biennials rather than set up structures of competition between them. So at the opposite scale. But, you know, that's huge. But I think we have to tackle these things.
You know,
that's why I talk about value change.
Okay.
Somebody has it, yeah.
I pretty much agree with what Andrea said, and actually I think it's very important initiative to that kind of construct that what John Roberts in recent book called internationalism of the margins. Because yes, we are very marginal. Look, one football player cost 3 documentaries. What are you talking about? So that's where actually hegemony lays in pop culture, not in art. But at the same time, to answer, I think, and then how we actually run into very delicate question, how we estimate the quality of that kind of institutions. And I think one of the most important quality, it's actually to think them politically, and first of all, to see what kind of constituency they can build around, constituency outside of art world, and also how they manage to accumulate support, not from art funding, but from other funding, from political funding, from union funding, from other type of grassroots funding. And that's something at stake, which we are not able right now to actually sort out, but I would think in this direction also the crisis of globalization, because it looks like right now the local things play much more important role, but only when they're able to create that internationalization of their visions and their politics. So that would be my comment.
On the mic in front of you. Just before your question, I just wanted to add something. You know, it's really bad mathematics to try to compare what you compare, because you know what, when it's to our benefit, we know how to calculate cultural and social capital and put its value into what art does, and when it's convenient, we drop that and we stick to the dollar. In fact, no, for sure, but I'm responding to him because I think in fact contemporary art has a great return value for larger geopolitical forces, for the fact that they put so little into it and they gain so much out of it actually. So this is what makes it worth in my not so humble opinion. So but we have more questions.
I mean, this is just something else it's probably embedded in what you're saying anyway, but basically I just want to think a little bit about how, I hate these terms local and global, they're so dated, But what I'd like to think about is the fact of increasing class divide in a country like first world, so-called Brexit country like Britain, but everywhere else, in fact, as well. A growing class divide, which is building all kinds of inequalities, violent inequalities, which you know then becomes a question of who is at the table to decide or speak about anything. So this contemporary art becomes a kind of space for kind of symbolic capital to be kind of engineered, whereby inequalities are being kind of peddled in order to produce symbolic capital, whether that's by curators, whether that's by institutions, whether that's by collectors, whoever manages it. It's a form of, it's moved from self-orientalizing, that puts the pressure on the artist to move from self-orientalizing to self-authenticating. And this is kind of a really weird other kind of schizophrenia that I can say that myself and Kojo, my colleague Kojo and the Otolith group, actually of an antagonism that we use to kind of create forms of abstraction. But those are kind of political abstractions that come from a history of political abstractions that are cultural and social. And I think that there is nobody wants to talk about race division. Feminism is big on the agenda, but racial inequality and class inequality is something that we really need to think about when it comes to education particularly.
I was going to like bring up when you said the question of like we need new terms is that we also need new art histories that challenges the way we understand the history of avant-garde, history of modernism, history of conceptualism. You know, like this is why people like October will get into printing books of like art after 1900, because they understand how important it is to, I mean, I'm not putting value judgment into what Hal Foster and company do, but that if they understood that like October has to become history, otherwise it would lose its prominence, is that we need to create other histories of art. There are young people here who are like intending to start to become new art historians in the audience. And like this is crucial, you know, alongside new languages, we need new histories of this like, you know, whether it's like specialized into talking about like a regional history of like a region in terms of modernism and conceptualism, or like just global, but we need, I think that I can add one word to that, is language and history. We need new language and new history.
Just to say that I know of lots and lots of projects that are doing that at the moment. I mean, apart from Stodelat looking at histories of community centers and art, you know, organizations like that. Jason Bowman in Sweden is running a big project called Stretch, which is looking at the history of arts organizations. There are people in the UK looking at the community center. Angelica from the Otolith group and I have spent a long time talking about community centers and their importance to us when we were kids, and the way in which the community center did cross over these things. So doing exactly what Dimitri has just said, which is not necessarily placing art at the locus of the kind of primordial center, you know, kind of strata of work, but actually it being a set of one of a set of things. So there is quite a lot of work being done. It would be good to collect that in some way. I wonder if it's being done in Korea, for instance.
예, 말씀 잘 들었습니다. 지금 말씀하신 그 질문에 저 굉장히 동감합니다. 아까 말씀하셨듯이 만들어진 연계상이 어떤 형상을 가져야 하는가라는 질문에 대해서 그 안에 있는 여러 가지 문제들도 있다라는 말씀을 하셨습니다. 안에 경쟁이 있고 분열이 생기고, 그리고 그 각각의 사이의 어떤 격차들, 차이들, 이것들을 어떻게 엮을 수 있는 것인가 하는 문제가 있습니다. 근데 이 문제를 사실은 제 영역으로 가져와서 다르게 말해보면 좀 다른 이야기가 됩니다. 어떤 것이냐면 이 격차가 있는 사회들을 어떻게 잘 엮을까라는 문제가 아니라 이 격차를 없애기 위해서 어떻게 엮을까라는 것이 됩니다. 예를 들면 지속 가능성에 대한 이야기를 할 때도 이렇게 이야기하게 됩니다. 이 하나의 어떤 그 미술 단체나 작은 규모를 갖고 있는 그런 단체들을 어떻게 지속할 것인가 하는 문제도 굉장히 중요하다고 생각해요. 제가 갖고 있는 영역에도 그런 작은 단체들이 있고요. 근데 그것과 동시에 저희가 사회를 생각하고 예술이 사회에 개입하려고 할 때 저희가 개입하려고 하는 또 다른 꼬뮌이 있습니다. 전혀 다른, 그리고 소리가 들리지 않는 꼬뮌들. 그 꼬뮌과 어떻게 지속적인 관계를 가져갈까라는 문제로 이렇게 변화하게 됩니다. 그래서 제가 드리고 싶은 말은 뭐 지금 많이 시간이 없다라는 말씀도 하셨는데 예술이 그 예술들 사이에 여러 가지 프로젝트를 엮는 것, 그것과 함께 예술과 사회가 엮어질 때의 문제들, 그런 문제들에 대해서 어떻게 생각을 하고 계시는지 그런 얘기를 저는 조금 더 듣고 싶습니다. 그리고 제 생각에는 예술이야말로 오늘 제일 처음에 한강 작가 이야기부터 시작했는데 죽은 자들의 이야기, 말해지지 않는 것들, 그리고 심지어 정치로부터 외압이 들어오는 것들도 아주 다른 방식으로 표현하고 사람들한테 말을 걸고, 그리고 이 회장이 아니라 밖으로 나갈 수 있는 사람의 마음을 움직이는 그런 것이라고 생각하기 때문입니다. 그래서 그런 식의 것들에 대해서 어떤 구상을 갖고 계신지 조금 더 듣고 싶습니다.
Let's just get some timekeeping. Yeah, some timekeeping. Why don't you? Well, maybe you want to like respond to this, and then we get one more question, and then we just call it out for the night.
I think I did more slow than that, but just to take on what you were asking in relation with which form it could be, and the question of, I found very interesting the idea of the conglomerate of spaces, what I would call communities of practice, in which the institutions and the duration happens, and then they connect with the ephemerality of the spectacular nature of institutional art and bring it there. I'm thinking, for example, in the practice of Cráter Invertido. No? Cráter Invertido has its own economy. It's a printing workshop. It's a community of practice in the sense that has a living space that is shared. And that economic independency also is important. And they somehow, a community of practice can pollute, in the good sense, no, the existing institution, and question the individual artist or the author, no, per se. So the experience of working together and not only just living together also, I think is crucial. And I think the network of agglomerate like that could also start to have an effect on how, as artists, we are working, no, and we produce.
So I think we have a question here, and that will be the last question for tonight. Introduce yourself, because artist from the Biennale.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Yolotl Alvarado. I'm part of Cooperativa Cráter Invertido. And I wanted to share like a discussion we have last weeks. In the collective, there was this invitation from private museum called Humex to make a talk about how do we work in the context of the Fishley and Weiss exhibition in Mexico. So we kind of take starting point, this decalogue, the picture that they take in a factory, that it's a mandate of how to work better, these 10 points, and kind of start thinking in our practice from each question, each mandate, no? Like learn to listen. You remember these 10 points, no? So at the end of this exercise, we said like, it's quite not enough, because for us, since the beginning, like Cráter was like not a working project, more like a life project for all of us. So we kind of think that there was something missing in this exercise, and we thought we should better ask a question of how to live better, no? So this repeating notion of network and this distinction between work and life, I think it's quite crucial to question and think more in a net life instead of network, no? For example. So, yeah. Also, like work, the notion of work comes with professionalization, no? And fields of knowledge, which life doesn't, because it's like a common No, so it's also.
Maybe we should leave it at NetLife. Okay, thank you everyone. Nightlife. Thank you so much.
Okay. So Mo and Jiyoung and Andrea and Fernando and Hangang, or thank you so much, and also all of you fellows and artists, other who are interested in the subject.